The rain was natural. That channel was not. I set it at 4:17 in the morning with cold water running over my boots and 35 villas glowing below me through sheets of Tennessee rain. From the top of my ridge, Lakecrest looked nothing like the polished waterfront community Patricia Caldwell had spent years advertising. Amber emergency lights reflected across flooded streets. Portable pumps hummed near the lowest row of homes. Residents carried boxes and household belongings toward higher ground, while county crews blocked the entrance to a water-covered section of road. Nobody was shouting where I stood. They did not need to. The sound coming through my property was louder than any argument Patricia and I had ever had. Water was rushing through a cut in the ridge where, for months earlier, there had been red clay, limestone, switchgrass, and 40 feet of uninterrupted high ground. I had owned those 80 acres for 16 years. I knew where water collected after a summer thunderstorm, where it crossed beneath my gravel road, and which culverts filled with leaves every October. I had never heard water moving through this spot because there had never been a channel here before. Then headlights climbed the service road behind me. A white sport utility vehicle stopped near the edge of the excavation, and Patricia stepped out wearing a raincoat over business clothes. Even at 4 in the morning, the 54-year-old HOA president carried a document folder under one arm. She stared down toward Lakecrest, then at the muddy water moving through the cut. "This storm is unprecedented," she said. I wiped rain from my face. "Maybe. The entire county is dealing with flooding. Maybe." Her eyes narrowed. "Then what exactly are you suggesting?" I pointed toward the channel between us. Freshly exposed clay along its sides had turned dark brown under the rain. Water from the upper lake was moving through that opening toward the lower basin faster than I had ever seen runoff cross this part of my land. "I am suggesting somebody should have answered my letter." Patricia looked away. 3 weeks earlier, my attorney had sent her a certified notice. Attached to it was a survey, an old contour map, photographs of the excavation, and a written recommendation from a civil engineer stating that the new connection materially changed existing drainage conditions and required proper hydraulic review. Patricia had signed for the envelope. I still had the receipt. She had answered 2 days later with 4 words I would eventually see enlarged on a conference room screen. "The project is authorized." Down below, another emergency vehicle turned into Lakecrest. Patricia watched it disappear behind a row of villas. "You cannot blame an improvement project for a major weather event." "I am not assigning blame." "That is exactly what you are doing." "No. I am standing on my property watching water travel through a channel your contractors excavated after I told you not to alter this ridge." For once, she had no immediate response. Rain tapped against the plastic cover on her folder. Somewhere below us, a backup alarm beeped as a public works truck reversed near the flooded road. I looked toward the 2 lakes. On a glossy HOA presentation, they had appeared almost side by side, 2 blue shapes separated by an inconvenient strip of land. Patricia had seen a recreational connection, higher property values, and a cleaner marketing brochure. I had seen elevations, drainage paths, property lines. She had called the ridge wasted space. That morning, 35 villa owners were discovering why ground does not have to look important to be doing an important job. And what Patricia still did not understand was that the storm was only half of her problem. The other half was already sitting in a certified mail file on my attorney's desk. 4 months earlier, the ridge was the quietest part of my property. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 51 years old, and I had owned those 80 acres outside Franklin, Tennessee, for 16 years. Before buying the land, I spent more than 20 years working as a civil site contractor and drainage supervisor. I was not a hydrologist or an engineer, and I never pretended to be one, but I knew how to read grades, recognize runoff patterns, maintain culverts, and understand what happens when somebody gives water a new place to go. My property sat between 2 lakes that looked deceptively close on a map. The upper lake rested northwest of the ridge, surrounded mostly by woods and open ground. The lower lake sat southeast, closer to Lakecrest Villas. Between them ran a natural rise of red Tennessee clay, limestone, switchgrass, and mature oak trees. It was not a dam. It was not some engineered flood wall. It was simply high ground separating drainage paths that had developed around the terrain. Every time we got serious rain, I walked the property afterward. I checked the 36-inch culvert beneath my gravel drive, cleared branches from 2 smaller crossings, inspected erosion near the lower pasture, and wrote down anything unusual in a weatherproof field notebook. My boots usually came home carrying enough red clay to stain the porch. That routine had saved me money more than once. Water leaves evidence if you pay attention. In early May, Patricia Caldwell arrived in a white luxury sport utility vehicle with a rolled presentation map and a leather document case. She was 54, president of the Lakecrest Villas Homeowners Association, and she had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to running meetings where everyone else waited for permission to speak. We stood near my eastern boundary while afternoon sunlight flashed across the lower lake. "We are considering a lake enhancement project," she said. "What kind of enhancement?" Patricia unrolled the map across the hood of her vehicle. The two lakes were colored a bright promotional blue. Between them was a curved blue line passing directly through my ridge. "A controlled connection," she said. "It would create a continuous recreational water feature and improve circulation between the lakes." I studied the map. There were little kayak symbols printed near the proposed channel. "Where is your property line?" I asked. Patricia tapped a shaded strip running across part of my parcel. "There is an existing drainage easement." That was not my question. Her smile tightened slightly. "The association has access rights in this corridor." "Access for what?" "Drainage maintenance and community infrastructure." I looked toward the ridge. From where we stood, it was not impressive. Grass, clay, scattered rock, a few trees. No concrete. No warning signs. Nothing that looked valuable to somebody selling waterfront villas. "Are you proposing to maintain an existing drain?" I asked. "Or excavate a new channel between two separate bodies of water?" Patricia rolled the map halfway closed. "Our consultants are still finalizing the scope. Then before anyone brings equipment onto my parcel, send me the recorded easement and the approved plans." "Daniel, this is intended to benefit the entire area. That still does not answer who owns the ground." She gave me the kind of patient look people use when they think resistance is just a misunderstanding waiting to disappear. "You are focusing on boundaries. We are focusing on improvement." I looked past her toward the lower lake and the rows of cream-colored villas beyond it. With drainage, those are often the same conversation. Patricia packed the map into her vehicle and left 10 minutes later. I walked the ridge before sunset. The ground was dry beneath my boots. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. The upper lake barely moved in the evening air. I stopped at the lowest saddle between the two basins and marked its location in my notebook. At the time, it was just another habit from an old career. For months later, I would stand on that exact spot in pouring rain and watch water travel through a path nature had never put there. Patricia did send me documents, just not the documents I had asked for. 3 days after our conversation, an email arrived with a polished project summary, a landscaping concept, and a copy of an old plat showing a drainage easement crossing the eastern side of my property. The proposed channel itself appeared as a bright blue curve laid over the map, like somebody had drawn it with a marker. I enlarged the plat on my computer and studied the legal notes along the margin. The easement referred to access, inspection, maintenance, and drainage facilities. I could not find anything that clearly said the Homeowners Association could excavate a brand new connection between two lakes. I replied with one question. "Please identify the recorded instrument granting Lakecrest Villas authority to construct a new channel across my parcel." Patricia answered the following afternoon. "The association has confirmed its rights within the drainage corridor." That sentence bothered me more than a refusal would have. I printed the email and placed it inside a folder with the plat. 2 weeks later, orange survey flags appeared near my eastern boundary. I walked out after breakfast and found 3 stakes running toward the lowest saddle in the ridge, the same place I had marked in my field notebook. The grass was wet with morning dew, and red clay clung to my boots as I followed them uphill. One stake carried a handwritten elevation. Another was marked proposed centerline. I photographed each one without moving anything. That afternoon, Patricia returned with a man wearing a reflective vest who introduced himself as a project consultant. She unrolled a revised plan across my tailgate. The recreational graphics were gone. Now the blue connection was labeled Drainage Improvement Channel. "That is interesting," I said. "Last month, it was a recreational water feature." Patricia kept her voice even. "Projects serve multiple purposes. Did the property line move too?" The consultant looked down at the plan. Patricia did not smile. "Daniel, The board has approved the improvement. The board can approve whatever it wants on association property. This is my parcel. She tapped the shaded easement. This corridor exists for drainage. Existing drainage does not automatically mean you can create a new flow path. The consultant finally spoke. The final grading details are still being coordinated. I turned toward him. Has anyone completed a hydraulic review for connecting the upper basin to the lower basin? He paused. I am not the hydraulic engineer. Then who is? Patricia rolled the plan closed before he could answer. We are not going to debate engineering in a pasture. Good. I am not an engineer either. That is why I am asking for the engineer. She exhaled slowly. You spent years doing site work. You understand that drainage corridors have to be maintained. I also understand the difference between cleaning a ditch and creating one. The wind moved through the switchgrass behind us. Somewhere downhill, a lawn crew was working inside Lake Crest, and I could hear the faint mechanical buzz of equipment across the lower lake. Patricia gathered her papers. The association intends to proceed within its legal rights. Then put those rights in writing. She left without answering. The next morning, I called a Franklin property attorney named Rebecca Sloan and sent her everything I had received. I also contacted a licensed surveyor I had worked with years earlier and asked him to locate the easement and property boundary on the ground. I was not trying to stop legitimate drainage maintenance. I wanted to know what the recorded documents actually allowed before somebody changed the terrain. 4 days later, Rebecca called. Do not interfere with any authorized easement maintenance, she said, but do not consent to new construction either. I want the full recorded instrument before I give you a stronger opinion. That was cautious enough for me. I wrote the date in my field notebook. Then I added another entry beneath it. Proposed centerline stakes observed at Ridge Saddle. 2 weeks later, a certified notice from Lake Crest arrived in my mailbox. It described upcoming drainage improvement work within the easement corridor. At the bottom was Patricia Caldwell's signature. There was no hydraulic report attached. No construction easement. No document answering my original question. Just a start date, 5 business days away. The work was supposed to begin on a Tuesday. On Monday afternoon, Rebecca sent Lake Crest a written objection requesting that no new excavation occur until the scope of the easement and the proposed drainage changes were verified. My surveyor had already marked the recorded boundary with yellow flags, and his preliminary field notes placed the lowest saddle of the ridge squarely inside my parcel. I photographed those flags before sunset, then walked the ridge one more time. Dry switchgrass brushed against my jeans. Cicadas rattled in the oak trees. The upper lake sat calm behind me, separated from the lower basin by the same ordinary rise of clay and limestone that had been there since long before Lake Crest existed. Tuesday morning came and went without equipment. Wednesday was quiet too. By Thursday, I thought Rebecca's letter had bought enough time for everyone to read the documents. Friday morning, I drove into Franklin to pick up replacement pipe fittings for a culvert near my north pasture. I was gone less than 2 hours. When I turned back onto my gravel road, I smelled diesel before I reached the house. Then came the sharper smell of freshly opened earth. I stopped the truck. An excavator was sitting near the ridge. A compact loader idled beside a spoil pile. The switchgrass at the saddle was gone, and a raw channel of red clay cut through the high ground toward the lower basin. For several seconds, I simply stared. The ridge had not disappeared, but the lowest section had been opened enough to create a continuous low path where none had existed before. Patricia's white sport utility vehicle was parked beside the contractor trucks. She stood near the excavation wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard. I walked toward her slowly. Who authorized this? She lowered the clipboard. The board approved the drainage improvement. Rebecca sent you a written objection Monday. Our council reviewed the project. Did your council give you permission to excavate my property? Her jaw tightened. We are working within the recorded drainage corridor. I looked at the excavator operator, then at the fresh cut. Please stop work until ownership and scope are verified. The foreman shut down the loader first. The sudden quiet made the scene feel even stranger. Patricia stepped closer. Daniel, you cannot obstruct authorized easement work. I am not touching your equipment. I am asking who authorized new excavation. She held up the clipboard. I did. That answer mattered. I took out my phone and photographed the cut from the eastern end, then the western end, then the grade stakes, equipment tracks, spoil piles, contractor vehicles, and yellow boundary flags. I did not move dirt. I did not block the channel. I did not climb into anybody's machine. Rebecca answered my call on the second ring. Document everything, she said. Do not alter the site. I am contacting their counsel. Next, I called my surveyor and asked him to return as soon as possible. The foreman introduced himself as Mark Ellison and showed me his work order when I asked what his company had been told. The scope described excavation and grading for a drainage connection. At the bottom was Patricia Caldwell's authorization on behalf of Lakecrest Villas. I photographed that too. Were you given the recorded easement? I asked. Mark nodded toward a folder in his truck. We were given a site plan and told access had been cleared. Were you given a hydraulic review? He hesitated. That would be above my end of the project. Patricia heard him. The engineering has been handled. Then give Rebecca the report, I said. She looked away toward the upper lake. By late afternoon, the equipment was gone, but the channel remained. Fresh red clay glowed against the green pasture like an open seam. I stood at the edge with my field notebook and wrote down the time, weather, equipment, contractor name, and visible dimensions of the cut. Then I looked from the upper lake toward the villas below. They thought they had opened a lake connection. What they had actually opened was a question nobody on that board had answered. By Saturday morning, the fresh cut had become the only thing I could see when I looked across the pasture. The excavators were gone, but their tracks remained pressed into the red clay, and the spoil piles sat along the channel like somebody had rearranged the land and expected the paperwork to catch up later. My surveyor, Thomas Reed, arrived shortly after 8 with his field equipment. He spent nearly 3 hours checking monuments, easement limits, and elevations before joining me beside the ridge. The channel crosses your parcel, he said, and most of this excavation is inside the drainage easement, but that only tells us where the easement is. It does not tell us what construction rights they have. That was Rebecca's legal question. My next question was technical. She recommended a licensed civil engineer named Laura Bennett, who specialized in stormwater and site drainage. Laura came Monday afternoon carrying old contour information, current survey data, and a tablet loaded with aerial mapping. We walked from the upper lake to the cut, then followed the natural slope toward the lower basin. My boots collected the same sticky red clay they always did after morning rain. Laura stopped at the lowest saddle and studied the exposed grade. I am not going to predict flooding from one site visit, she said. There are too many variables. That is not what I need. Good. What I can tell you is that this excavation creates a new preferential flow path between areas that were previously separated by higher ground. That changes existing drainage conditions. She pointed toward Lakecrest. Before anybody treats this as a permanent connection, I would want hydraulic calculations, storm event assumptions, downstream capacity, erosion controls, and stabilized grades. Have you seen any of that? Not yet. Rebecca requested the engineering package from Lakecrest that afternoon. What came back was surprisingly thin. The concept plan, contractor grading sheet, board authorization, and correspondence describing the work as drainage improvement. There was no hydraulic report in the material provided to us. Laura put her concerns in writing without claiming more than she could support. Her letter said the newly excavated channel materially altered the drainage configuration and recommended that the connection not remain in service without appropriate hydraulic review and stabilization. Rebecca attached that letter to a formal notice and sent it by certified mail to Patricia, the board, and Lakecrest Council. I photographed the envelope before it left. 3 days later, the delivery receipt came back signed. Patricia Caldwell. I stapled it inside my field notebook. Her response arrived 2 days after that. For words sat beneath the Lakecrest letterhead. The project is authorized. I read them twice. Then I looked at the old contour map Laura had left on my kitchen table. On paper, the upper and lower lakes were only inches apart. The elevation markings told a different story. I was careful not to pretend I could calculate what a major storm would do. Laura had been careful too. Nobody had predicted 35 flooded villas. Nobody had said disaster was guaranteed. The warning was simpler. The drainage conditions had changed, and the downstream consequences needed professional review. That should have been enough to make anyone slow down. Instead, the cut remained open. Over the next 2 weeks, I photographed it after every rainfall and recorded conditions in my notebook. Light showers left a narrow, muddy trace through the channel. A stronger storm produced visible runoff toward the lower basin. Each time, the red clay showed me exactly where the water preferred to travel now. Then, On a Monday evening in September, my phone displayed a weather alert for heavy rainfall later that week. I opened my notebook, checked the latest photographs, and looked through the kitchen window toward the dark line of the ridge. Patricia had spent months insisting the association had authority. The weather was about to ask a completely different question: whether anyone had bothered to understand what they authorized. By Wednesday afternoon, the forecast had stopped using words like possible and started using words like expected. A slow-moving storm system was pulling moisture across Middle Tennessee, and the Weather Service was warning that repeated bands of heavy rain could pass over the same areas through Thursday night. I called Laura before dinner. "I saw the forecast," she said. "Do not modify the channel yourself. If conditions become concerning, document what you can safely observe and contact the appropriate local authorities." That was already my plan. I was not going to push dirt into flowing water, block a drainage path with equipment, or improvise some revenge scheme because Patricia had ignored a letter. Water does not care who is right. By Thursday morning, the air felt heavy enough to hold in your hands. Leaves turned their pale undersides toward the wind. The first rain arrived before noon, soft against the metal roof of my equipment shed. By 3, gutters were running steadily. I checked the 36-inch culvert beneath my gravel drive from a safe distance, then walked the higher route toward the ridge. The new channel already carried a shallow ribbon of brown runoff. I photographed it, recorded the time, and returned home. At 6:20, Patricia called. "Daniel, are you doing anything with the drainage corridor?" "No, we have residents asking about water levels." "Then you should contact your engineer. You know this property better than anyone. And your board was warned that the drainage configuration had changed." Silence filled the line for several seconds. "This is a major storm," she finally said. "Then treat it like one." By 8, the rain had become a continuous roar against my windows. I checked county alerts and stayed inside except for brief observations from safe high ground. At 9:45, I could hear water moving through the cut from farther away than before. The sound was different now, deeper and steady. I called the county non-emergency number and reported increased flow through a recently excavated drainage connection above a residential area. I gave them the location, explained that an engineer had previously recommended hydraulic review, and answered their questions without speculating about what would happen next. Near midnight, emergency notifications began appearing on my phone about localized road flooding. I looked through the kitchen window. Rain blurred the lights along Lakecrest's entrance road. At 12:38, I put on my raincoat and walked only as far as the stable high ground above the channel. My flashlight caught muddy water moving through the opening toward the lower basin. The red clay that had stained my boots all summer was almost invisible beneath it. I took one photograph from where I stood and backed away. There was nothing useful I could safely do with a shovel, tractor, or argument. At 2:14, Rebecca texted asking whether conditions were stable. I told her the flow had increased and that I had already notified the county. At 3:26, flashing amber lights appeared beyond the trees near Lakecrest. More followed. By 4, the lower access road was partially covered, and crews were directing vehicles away from the lowest section of the development. Then Patricia's headlights climbed the service road toward my property. I walked back to the ridge overlook as her white sport utility vehicle stopped behind me. Below us, emergency lights reflected across water where streets and lawns should have been. The storm had not chosen a side. It had simply followed gravity. And for the first time since Patricia's contractors cut through that ridge, everyone could see where the new path led. By sunrise, the rain had weakened from a roar to a steady hiss, and Lakecrest finally became visible through the gray morning. 35 villas in the lowest sections had taken on water around garages, patios, ground-level rooms, or landscaped areas, though the severity varied from one property to another. County crews had closed 2 internal roads while portable pumps moved water away from low spots. Residents carried storage bins, rugs, and small furniture toward dry areas. I stayed out of their way. Nobody down there needed an argument about property rights while they were trying to protect their homes. Patricia stood beside me on the ridge for less than 5 minutes before driving back toward Lakecrest. She had called the storm unprecedented. I had not disagreed. What mattered was whether the altered drainage path had made the consequences worse. That question belonged to people with better instruments than mine. Around 8:30, A county public works supervisor named Eric Dawson arrived with 2 staff members. I showed them the cut from stable ground, then gave Eric Laura's engineering letter, my photographs from before and after excavation, and the certified mail receipt bearing Patricia's signature. I am not telling you this channel caused everything below, I said. I am telling you it did not exist before the association excavated it, and they were warned that it changed drainage conditions. Eric nodded. That distinction matters. By afternoon, Lakecrest Insurer had engineers on site, and Rebecca told me not to speculate with residents or board members. Give investigators the records, she said. Let the technical findings speak for themselves. So I did. My field notebook showed the ridge. Before excavation, the proposed centerline stakes, the date the contractor arrived, the rainfall observations, and every photograph I had taken afterward. Mark Ellison's company provided its work order. Patricia's signature was still at the bottom. 2 days later, Laura returned with an independent engineering team. They surveyed the channel, documented erosion, compared the upper and lower elevations, and inspected downstream drainage capacity. Nobody announced a dramatic conclusion on the hillside. Real investigations do not work that way. The first written findings arrived the following week. The storm itself was identified as a major rainfall event, but the newly excavated connection was listed as a significant contributing factor in redirecting additional flow toward the lower basin during peak conditions. I read that sentence twice. It did not say Patricia created the storm. It did not say one channel explained every flooded property. It said something much harder for Lakecrest to dismiss. The land had been changed, and that change mattered. That evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Patricia sat at the front table with the same polished posture she had worn the first day. She showed me the blue presentation map. Rebecca and I sat near the back. A board member named Charles Whitaker placed 4 documents on the table: the drainage easement, Patricia's authorization, Laura's warning letter, and the delivery receipt. When did the board receive the hydraulic review? He asked. Patricia looked toward the association attorney. Our consultants considered drainage conditions. Charles repeated the question. When did we receive the hydraulic review? Nobody answered. Then Rebecca handed the attorney one more document, Patricia's written response to our certified warning. For words beneath Lakecrest letterhead. The project is authorized. The room went quiet. Months earlier, Patricia had treated those words like the end of the discussion. Now 35 villa owners were sitting behind her, waiting to learn what exactly she had authorized. The emergency meeting lasted almost 3 hours. But the most important moment came when Charles unfolded Patricia's original presentation map across the board table. The 2 lakes were still colored bright blue, and the proposed connection still curved neatly through my ridge. Months earlier, that map had been designed to sell an improvement. Now the association attorney studied it beside the excavation work order and asked a very different question. Was this connection treated as maintenance of an existing drainage facility or construction of a new one? Patricia looked toward the board's consultant. He shifted in his chair. The project evolved during planning. That does not answer the question, Charles said. I recognized the silence that followed. It was the same silence I had heard beside my truck when I asked Patricia where her property line was. The board voted that night to suspend her authority to approve infrastructure work while outside counsel reviewed the project. They also authorized an independent engineering assessment and emergency stabilization measures around the channel. Nobody celebrated. 35 villa owners still had cleanup ahead of them. Over the next 2 weeks, the paperwork became more damaging than any argument could have been. Mark Ellison's company produced emails showing that his foreman had asked Lakecrest whether access and excavation authority were confirmed before mobilization. Patricia had answered that the association had cleared both. Rebecca compared that email with the recorded easement. The easement described drainage access and maintenance rights within a defined corridor, but Lakecrest's own attorneys would not claim that the language clearly granted unlimited authority to create a new interlake connection across my parcel. Then the independent engineers completed their preliminary analysis. They documented the major rainfall, existing downstream limitations, and several contributing conditions. But they also confirmed that excavation through the ridge had created a preferential flow path that had not existed in the prior terrain configuration and had increased flow toward the lower basin during the storm. That finding changed everything. Lakecrest's insurance carrier requested the full project file. Attorneys representing affected owners requested board records. The association began discussing remediation instead of recreation. The little kayak symbols on Patricia's original concept suddenly looked absurd beside photographs of muddy streets and portable pumps. Rebecca kept me focused. Your goal is restoration and protection of your property rights, she said. Do not turn this into revenge. I did not need to. Patricia had signed the work order, signed for the warning letter, and answered that warning in writing. Every step she had taken to make herself look decisive had created another piece of the timeline. By the third week, Lakecrest agreed that no further excavation would occur without my written consent where required, verified easement authority, and an approved engineering plan. Temporary erosion controls were installed under professional supervision, while engineers designed a permanent solution. At the next board meeting, Charles announced a new rule requiring recorded property rights, engineering scope, and applicable technical review to be documented before any future association infrastructure project could be authorized. Patricia sat 2 seats away without her usual document folder. One resident asked why those requirements had not existed before. Nobody gave a satisfying answer. After the meeting, Patricia caught me near the clubhouse door. You wanted this, she said quietly. No, I answered. I wanted you to stop before the excavation. Her expression hardened. You think a few documents make you right? I looked through the glass doors toward the dark outline of the ridge. No. The documents only show that I asked you to check. She walked away without replying. That was when I understood the part Patricia had missed from the beginning. The map had never been my strongest evidence. Neither had the photographs, the survey, or even the engineer's warning. The strongest evidence was the sequence connecting all of them. She had been warned before the storm, she had been asked to verify authority before excavation, and she had chosen to proceed anyway. The water had exposed the mistake. The paperwork made sure nobody could bury it again. By late November, the ridge looked like land again instead of evidence. Lakecrest's insurer and the association reached an agreement that funded remediation under a plan reviewed by licensed engineers, and nobody touched the site until the survey limits, easement rights, drainage calculations, and construction responsibilities were written down clearly. That alone felt different from the way the whole mess had started. Crews worked from approved grades, stabilized disturbed soil, restored the drainage divide where required by the final plan, and installed erosion protection where runoff still needed controlled passage. I watched from a distance most days. I had spent enough of my life around construction equipment to know that the best projects are usually the least dramatic ones. Measurements get checked. Questions get answered. People stop when something does not match the plan. By the time the last truck left, grass seed and erosion control matting covered the raw red clay that had once looked like an open seam across my property. The upper lake was still the upper lake. The lower lake was still the lower lake. No glossy blue recreational connection ran between them. Lakecrest repaired damaged common areas and worked through claims involving the 35 affected villas. I never pretended every dollar, every inconvenience, or every ruined piece of flooring could be erased by a board vote. Consequences do not disappear just because responsibility finally becomes uncomfortable. Patricia resigned as HOA president before the end of the year. The official notice called it a personal decision. Charles Whitaker became interim president and sent residents a new infrastructure policy requiring documented property authority, engineering review when applicable, contractor verification, and board disclosure before major work could begin. Rebecca forwarded me a copy with one sentence in her email. This is what prevention looks like. I printed it and placed it in the same folder as Patricia's forward response. The project is authorized. I kept that page not because I enjoyed what happened afterward, but because it reminded me how expensive certainty becomes when nobody checks what it is built on. A few weeks later, a light December rain moved across the property just before sunrise. Nothing severe. Just enough to darken the fence posts and bring that familiar smell of wet leaves and Tennessee clay through my open equipment shed. I pulled on my old boots and walked my usual route. I checked the 36-inch culvert under the gravel drive, cleared a handful of leaves from a smaller crossing, and continued toward the ridge with my field notebook tucked inside my jacket. Water beaded on the new grass. The restored ground held its shape. Runoff followed the reviewed drainage paths instead of pouring through the excavation that had connected the basins during the storm. I stood at the same saddle where Patricia had once spread her presentation map across the hood of her white sport utility vehicle. I could almost see that bright blue line again, curving neatly across land somebody had decided was inconvenient. The strange thing was that Patricia had never really seen the ridge. She had seen an used space between two amenities. I had seen property lines and elevations. Laura had seen drainage conditions. Rebecca had seen an easement whose words mattered more than a board's assumptions. And eventually, the investigators had seen a chain of decisions preserved in surveys, emails, photographs, engineering letters, and one certified mail receipt. I looked down at my boots. Red clay had collected around the soles again, exactly as it had months earlier. Then I heard water moving through the proper crossing below me, quiet and ordinary, almost easy to ignore. That was the lesson Lakecrest had paid dearly to learn. Patricia thought the ridge was just dirt in the way. The engineers called it drainage. The deed called it mine. And the water proved why both mattered.